The images you are currently seeing were recorded on June 1, 1945, and show a German prisoner of war named Heinz Petry. Surrounding him are American soldiers escorting him to his death. Shortly, he will be executed by order of the American Army on charges of espionage. We can see a priest approaching Heinz for his final confession. The young man exchanges a few words with him and then continues walking calmly toward his ultimate fate. What is about to happen is one of the most controversial events of World War II, as Heinz was just 16 years old. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything about the German teenagers executed by the United States. Heinz Petry was born on December 31, 1928, in the town of Euskirchen in eastern Germany. Little is known about his personal life, but it is known that his parents ran a daycare center and were considered loyal citizens to the Nazi regime. The boy grew up in a nation completely subordinated to Hitler's dictates, and from a young age, he was taught the importance of obeying the Führer. He never knew anything other than the ideals of hatred, racism, and anti-Semitism of the National Socialist movement. During primary school, Heinz Petry was a good student and excelled in sports activities. For this reason, he was chosen by German authorities to enter one of the many Adolf Hitler schools. These educational institutions had been established in 1937 and functioned as boarding schools for German children with the highest grades. They were supervised by the Hitler Youth, and their mission was to train the future elite of the Third Reich. To be admitted, the racial background of the candidate, as well as their health and their family's commitment to Nazism, were investigated. Heinz met all the requirements to enter, so he quickly became one of the top students at Drachenberg Castle School. This is what the site looks like today. As expected, these schools did not only provide basic knowledge of social, natural, and exact sciences, but they also taught the fundamentals of National Socialist ideology. These institutions served as true indoctrination centers, whose goal was to brainwash young people, erase their personalities, and turn them into automatons willing to die for Hitler. Heinz was there until early 1945, when he had just turned 16, the moment when his life was about to take a 180-degree turn. The school supervisors, who were also the regional party authorities, saw in the young man the right person for a risky mission. They proposed that he join the Werewolf, a secret Nazi organization founded by Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS. It had been created to initiate a clandestine resistance movement against the Allies. By then, the leaders of Germany were aware that defeat was imminent, and the country would fall into the hands of England, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. In this context, the Werewolf's duty would be to harass the victors through assassinations, sabotage, and terrorist actions. In other words, they would operate in the same way as the French, Italian, or Yugoslav partisans who had harassed the Nazi occupation governments of their countries for years. Heinz Petry joined the Werewolf and received brief military training. Between January 15 and February 5, he learned to use pistols, rifles, and homemade plastic explosives. Despite the intensity of the training, it was still incomplete, as there was not enough time to turn him into a real soldier. Furthermore, even the trainers had little experience on the battlefield and barely knew how dynamite worked. This clandestine organization was sustained by idealism and militant fervor. Above all, they were young people who refused to accept that the Third Reich was dying. Here you can see the testimony of a former Werewolf member describing their tasks.
Wir sollten hinter den Linien dann Verkehrsverbindungen kappen, Brücken sprengen, Unruhe stiften, kleine Morde begehen.
During this period, Heinz met his future partner, Joseph Schoner. He was a 17-year-old who belonged to the local branch of the Hitler Youth. He volunteered for the Werewolf because he wanted to prove his bravery, but also because he wanted to clear his family's honor. It was said that his father, the manager of a hotel in the city of Stahlberg, had been sentenced to death in 1944 for smuggling goods on the black market. Although this was never confirmed, the rumors had affected Joseph to the point where he agreed to participate in a dangerous operation just to clear his name. The Werewolf tasked Petrie and Chenogne with infiltrating behind enemy lines and spying on the United States Army, which at that time was advancing rapidly on Germany. As you can see in this newsreel footage, American tanks were moving through cities reduced to rubble by bombings.
Units of the 1st United States Army captured the important town of Limburg. Still under fire from the Germans, armored vehicles thunder on into the ruins of the town.
By February 1945, U.S. troops were preparing to cross the Ruhr River, join forces with the British, and then advance to the Rhine River. It was a crucial move, as it placed them close to the heart of the Third Reich. German High Command was aware of this, so they sent Heinz and Joseph on a reconnaissance mission. The young men were to assess the number of enemy troops, their equipment, and their level of organization. On February 21st, the novice spies were deployed in the Heinsberg district, east of the country, near the American position. We can imagine that for them, it was a moment of maximum adrenaline. They probably thought that Germany's last defense depended on them and their success. They had never been on a battlefield before, but now, overnight, they were alone in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by Hitler's mortal enemies. A misstep could cost them their lives, so they had to act with utmost care if they wanted to come out of it in one piece. Despite their bravery, the training they received was extremely poor, and this was their downfall. The 9th United States Army captured them the next day, on February 22nd, in a small village called Bergden. They were found hiding in a ditch in the ground while reporting on the activities of the Americans to their superiors. There is an important detail to consider: the spies were dressed as civilians. If Heinz and Joseph had been in their soldier uniforms, they would have been treated as regular combatants and sent to prison until the end of the war. However, operating behind the lines of another army without the official attire of a soldier was considered a war crime. The Americans treated Petrie and Chenogne with the utmost severity. They were subjected to harsh interrogation, during which they were forced to confess that they were indeed conducting espionage activities for the Werewolf. They were then imprisoned in a jail in the city of Aachen, while their fate was being decided. On March 29, a war tribunal composed of American officers met to discuss the case and ultimately sentenced both young men to death. The measure was approved by a 2/3 majority and justified the sentence as follows: Petrie and Chenogne must pay the highest penalty for their crime, so that the German people know that we are determined to eliminate the poison of German militarism and Nazi ideology from the face of the earth. The young men tried to escape death by appealing to the tribunal and pleading for mercy from the American generals. However, it was the Commander-in-Chief of the 9th United States Army, General William Hood Simpson, who rejected their plea. In reality, the true reason for the execution was related to the Werewolf. The enemies of fascism still did not know how many members it had or what its firepower was. Days before the sentence of the teenagers was announced, Himmler's clandestine organization had assassinated a mayor appointed to his post by the Allies. It was a significant attack because it showed that the Werewolf was not willing to submit to the invaders and would fight with all its might to prevent National Socialism from dying. In this context, it was decided to execute Hans and Joseph to send a message to all those who still supported Hitler. Its meaning was clear: the times had changed, the Third Reich was about to disappear, and those who resisted it would shed their blood on the ground, as these two young men were about to do. Such deterrent measures were considered essential to prevent anyone from opposing the Allies. The execution, however, was delayed for a couple of months while Germany was being cornered and brought to its knees. The day of the sentence was set for June 1, 1945, in the German city of Brunswick, weeks after the German surrender. A few hours before, Heinz Petrie wrote a farewell letter to his parents and his brother. The image you are currently seeing shows Oscar, Heinz's brother, who has preserved the sheet where the spy scribbled his last words. As you can see, It is a fragile and yellowed piece of paper, but the ink has not faded, and the letters can still be read clearly. Let's read an excerpt from it. We still had hopes of being pardoned, but on May 30th, after waiting for 2 months, they suddenly took us to Brunswick. Here they told us that we will be shot at 10 in the morning. Once, an American officer assured me that, to him, we are people who gave our best for our homeland and did nothing dishonorable. That's why I ask you not to be ashamed, but proud of my actions. Everything I did was not for a government that betrayed us, but for the hope of serving my beloved country and my people. Heinz also dedicated some words to his brother, who was 9 years old at the time. And you, dear Oscar, have to be a support for our parents. You are probably too young to understand everything that is happening, but in the coming years, when you reread these lines, you will find in them your legacy. Petry and Chenogne were taken to a gravel quarry, the place where they would be executed by firing squad. They were not the only ones sentenced, there were also 4 other spies waiting their turn to be shot. There were photographers taking pictures, and television cameras recording everything. The Americans wanted the moment to be recorded in as much detail as possible, to later broadcast the footage so the Germans could see with their own eyes what awaited them if they rebelled or joined the Werewolf. Heinz Petry was the first to be executed. A military priest gave him the last rites and heard his final wishes, although since the footage is silent, we cannot know for certain what the young man said. He was then taken to one of the 2 posts where the condemned would be bound and blindfolded. At that moment, the firing squad entered, lining up in front of the young man, awaiting the firing signal. His body was placed in a coffin by members of the German Red Cross and moved from the scene. Now it was Joseph Chonogne's turn, who was tied to the second post but, unlike his companion, faced death with his face uncovered. The executions continued, as there were still 4 other spies. One by one, the prisoners were gunned down by the fusillade. It was a bloody day that caught the attention of the major Western media. The debate revolved around the ages of Petry and Chenogne, and their defenders argued that they were little more than children who did not understand what they had gotten involved in. The bodies of Heinz and Joseph were buried 3 days later in the Brunswick cemetery. 3 years later, in 1948, Petry's family requested that the young man's remains be exhumed and transferred to Euskirchen, his hometown. Today, this story is remembered as one of the most controversial episodes of the final phase of World War II. Some criticize the coldness of the American army, while others believe that these executions were necessary to prevent future Nazi uprisings. What to do with the Nazi criminals? That was the question on the minds of the Allied leaders as World War II was heading towards victory for their side. Interestingly, the answer was found in the German city of Nuremberg. There, one of the most significant legal proceedings in history took place when 24 of the most powerful Nazi leaders were tried for the crimes committed by the Third Reich. The end of the conflict did not mean the end of the deaths, as 12 of these German leaders were sentenced to die by hanging. In this video, we will tell you what happened to the dozen condemned by the Nuremberg Tribunal and the incredible and macabre fate of their corpses. Welcome to another installment of military history. With the surrender of Germany in early May 1945, there was joy around the world, but also a tremendous responsibility. What would happen to the most important war criminals of the Third Reich? Winston Churchill and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, had a carefully planned strategy. They believed that as many leaders as possible should be detained and then subjected to a severe trial wherever they were found. The process had to be led by the highest military authority present, and the execution had to take place within 6 hours. For the British leader, the only way to move forward and deter future Nazi uprisings was the elimination of the remaining leaders, including collaborators who had held power. However, there was a surprising twist in the resolution, as Stalin and the Soviets strongly opposed this approach. They demanded trials be conducted where the crimes had been committed. This surprised everyone, but they eventually reached an agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, organizing one of the most famous legal and political events in history, the Nuremberg trials of 1945. The tribunal, established in October of that year by representatives of the Allied powers, aimed to judge the involvement of a long list of Third Reich personalities in the crimes committed during the war. For a year, dozens of accused and witnesses passed through the Nuremberg courtroom, including 24 senior Nazi officers who were charged with 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
On the count of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging.
Contrary to what one might imagine, the Nazi leaders preferred to be executed immediately, as they did not want to go down in history in a shameful manner. The Allies did not grant their request for immediate execution but instead opted for a trial. Through the Nuremberg trials, which formally began on November 20, 1945, they wanted the world to understand that the response to barbarism and dehumanization was a fair legal process, not revenge. The convicted Nazis received different sentences, but 12 of them, the highest-ranking officials, were sentenced to death by hanging. They were Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe and Deputy Chancellor of the Führer, Hans Frank, former Governor-General of Poland, Wilhelm Frick, former Interior Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Alfred Jodl, former Commander of the Eastern Army, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, former Commander of Extermination Camps, Alfred Rosenberg, philosopher and Nazi ideologue, Fritz Sokol, former Director of the Slave Labor Program, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, former Director of the Reichsbank, Wilhelm Keitel, former Commander of the German Army, and Julius Streicher, former editor of the fanatical anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer. 2 of the condemned did not die by hanging. The first was Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Hitler's secretary, and party leader, who was tried in absentia. For decades, it was believed that he had managed to escape, with some even claiming to have seen him in South America, or he was thought to be running a secret network. There were those who believed he had died in the fall of Berlin in those final days of the regime when Soviet soldiers entered. After much suspense, forensic studies of remains found at the site determined that Bormann had died in the German capital in 1945. In addition to Martin Bormann, the other leader who escaped the fate of hanging was Hermann Göring, Hitler's official successor after his death, who had asked to be shot to die with honor during the trial. He ultimately evaded his sentence by committing suicide the night before by biting into a cyanide pill. For years, it was unknown how he had obtained it until, nearly half a century later, an American soldier confessed that he had provided it, but he had been deceived. According to his account, one afternoon, as he was leaving the detention center, he was approached by a beautiful German girl and 2 men. They asked him to give the prisoner a supposed medicine that Göring needed to deal with his coronary problems. From the announcement of the sentences to the executions, 2 weeks passed, adding to the long 11 months of the trials. As expected, all the convicts appealed to have their death sentences revoked, or in case the sentences were upheld, to be executed by a firing squad, as hanging was considered a dishonorable death. On October 11, the court rejected the appeals and upheld the convictions, so the next day, the condemned could see their families for the last time. In the early hours of October 16, 1946, the sentences were carried out, and 10 of the Nazi leaders were hanged dishonorably. While Göring's lifeless body lay in the prison morgue, the other 10 condemned to death were hanged one after another in just 1 hour and 34 minutes. The location used was the prison gymnasium. At 1:11 in the morning, Ribbentrop was the first to be hanged. All were allowed to speak some last words, and the most common were patriotic references. For instance, the foreign minister firmly stated, "God protect Germany," and then added, "My last wish is that German unity endures, that an understanding is reached between the East and the West, and peace for the world."
Others continued to proclaim their hatred of Jews until the last moment, as was the case with Julius Streicher, the anti-Semitic propagandist who shouted Heil Hitler as they led him upstairs.
From the gallows, while they placed the rope around his neck, he declared loudly, "The Bolsheviks will hang all of you someday."
Purimfest 1946, in reference to a Jewish holiday, as a mockery.
The executioners of the Nazi leaders were Sergeant Major John C. Woods and his assistant, military police officer Joseph Malta.
It was rumored at the time that Woods intentionally miscalculated the lengths of the ropes used for the executions so that some of the men did not die quickly from the intended neck fracture but were strangled slowly. Some reports from the time indicated that some executions took 14 to 28 minutes. The army denied claims that the drop length was too short or that the condemned died from strangulation instead of a neck fracture. Another curious detail is that the trapdoor was too small, so several of the condemned suffered sharp head injuries when they hit their heads during the fall. According to German law, the bodies were supposed to be returned to the families within 24 hours of the execution, but the Allies were concerned about an issue that troubled them. Authorities feared that the remains or the burial site of figures like Göring would become a Nazi cult site. This suspicion led them to dismiss the idea of handing over the remains to the families and instead do something entirely different, and in some cases, considered indecorous. It seemed that the karma of the atrocities committed by these Third Reich leaders was not finished with their execution. The bodies were photographed as protocol suggested. Then, they were stripped and placed in cheap wooden coffins. They were given false identities with the names of supposed American soldiers to conceal the plan that was underway. Under this guise, the remains were transported to the Ostfriedhof crematorium in Munich. Once there, and with extreme care since other soldiers' funerals were taking place, they were individually cremated and placed in carefully labeled urns with their fake names. After the bodies were incinerated, the urns were transferred to an American mortuary unit about 20 kilometers from where they had been cremated. At the site, the urns were destroyed, and their ashes were scattered into an undisclosed location in the Isar River. Their clothing and uniforms were incinerated, while their badges with gold, silver, or precious stones were preserved for the materials to be reused. Other highly symbolic decorations, such as the iron crosses characteristic of the Nazis, many of which were obtained through criminal actions, were condemned to oblivion. In late 1944, the United States Army learned something chilling. At the time, the Americans were fighting the Germans in the Ardennes, a forested region located between Luxembourg and Belgium. The cold and snow were devastating, making the battle experience even more savage. The misery on the scene was made worse by the news that on December 17, 1945, Waffen-SS troops had committed carnage. Near the town of Malmedy, there had been a brief battle between the Americans and the Germans, which had resulted in a victory for the latter. In total, the Germans captured 84 enemies, whom they made prisoners of war. However, what happened next was an offense against the rules of all warfare, which stipulate that those detained in combat must receive dignified treatment. The Americans were forced to march to an abandoned farmhouse and line up. In front of them, 120 Germans armed with machine guns positioned themselves, who opened fire without any kind of mercy. Bursts of bullets tore apart the prisoners and left them dying on the ground, covered in lead and their clothing torn, bleeding from dozens of wounds. The few who tried to flee were shot in the back. Some took refuge in a nearby building, but the Germans caught up with them moments later and set it on fire. Meanwhile, at the same time that people were dying from the fire, some SS men walked among the still living machine gunners and finished them off with shots to the head. Hours later, the news reached the ears of the U.S. Army commanders. As expected, the rumors of the massacre soon spread among the common troops, who could not believe what had happened. Indignation was mixed with rage, hatred, and a desire for revenge. Little did the Germans know that they had inaugurated a cycle of violence that would soon turn against them. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the Chenogne massacre. To understand this story, we must first understand the plans of Nazi Germany. Towards the end of 1944, the Third Reich was hemmed in by its enemies and defeat was predicted to be near. Adolf Hitler was willing to fight until all his resources were exhausted, so on December 16 of that year, he launched the Ardennes Offensive. It was a massive attack by the Wehrmacht, whose army consisted of 400,000 soldiers, 500 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces. If things went according to plan, the aggressor force would tear the Allies apart and force them to sign a peace treaty, ending World War II and giving Hitler a graceful exit from the conflict. One day after the Ardennes campaign began, the brutal massacre at Malmedy took place. 84 American soldiers were executed in cold blood by the Waffen-SS, their bodies left out in the open. When they found them, the snow had covered them and dried the blood they had spilled, but the suffering was etched on their faces. They had been riddled with machine gun fire, although the most unfortunate had been burned alive. The news of the massacre was a scandal among the United States Army, and the commanders themselves used it as propaganda. By telling their troops what had happened, they took the opportunity to spread the idea that the Germans had no humanity and were little more than wild beasts. On the other hand, it served to remind the soldiers of the reason for their fight, which was to avenge the victims of massacres like the one in Malmedy. Little by little, the desire to avenge the fallen and execute the Nazis responsible took shape among the troops. This was helped by the fact that the American generals gave the order not to take any SS prisoners. Although this directive did not include the duty to execute anyone, the truth is that it was a subtle way of indicating to the soldiers that the execution of Germans would not be frowned upon, and that it would not even be judged by a military court. After all, if an enemy was captured and the rules stated that he could not be a prisoner, the only options available were to let him go or kill him, and allowing him to leave was a danger, since he could tip off his enemies' companions or look for reinforcement troops. On January 1, 1945, there was little to celebrate, as the Ardennes campaign continued to command American attention. They had been confident that they could thwart Hitler's offensive with relative ease, but 2 weeks had passed since the launch of the operation and they had still not driven the Germans back. The situation had now been reduced to a series of brief but intense combats fought on frozen farms or in small towns of just a few hundred inhabitants. In this context, one of the U.S. Army units, the 11th Armored Infantry Division, received the order to capture the village of Chenogne. From the start, the plan was fraught with drawbacks. The first and foremost was that the division had no battle experience. On the other hand, they were sure that they would have air support, but this was not possible since a thick fog took over the field and prevented the planes from flying over the area. The Americans of the 11th advanced almost blindly, through wisps of mist and bitter cold, until they sighted their objective. It was a humble town of just 30 houses, a church, a school, and a market. They did not realize that the Germans were waiting for them armed with anti-tank and anti-aircraft artillery. When they least expected it, the ambush began, and bloody combat broke out, turning Chenogne into a smoking heap of ruins. The fight ended when the Americans outflanked the Germans and forced them to lay down their weapons, making them prisoners of war. It was a bitter victory, as dozens of Americans died in the process, and those who survived were in shock, having never fought before. They were enraged by the ambush, and the memory of the Malmedy massacre burned within them, too. However, none of this justifies what happened next. Sergeant John Faig was a soldier in the division who remembers it as follows. "Some of ours forced the Germans into line. I knew what was about to happen, and I didn't like it at all. They led a group of 30 prisoners up a hill outside the town, so that what was done to them could not be seen. The remaining 25 Germans were taken to the field and forced to stand along a path. These boys were about to be shot with machine guns. We Americans were repeating the crimes of the Germans and the Japanese." Sergeant Faig does not describe in detail what happened next, but it is known that the Americans took aim at the Wehrmacht soldiers and pulled the trigger.
As at Malmedy, a shower of lead rained down on the prisoners, killing them instantly. It is estimated that, in total, between 50 and 60 Germans died, and that their bodies were left in the snow. It was one of the largest war crimes committed by the United States Army. In fact, General George S. Patton was informed of the facts, and noted the following in his personal diary: "The 11th Armored Division is still too green. The last time they fought they suffered numerous unnecessary casualties. They also murdered about 50 Germans. I hope we can hide it." The U.S. High Command covered up the massacre and hampered any kind of official investigation. In this way, what happened in Chenogne remained silent for decades. The corpses of the shot Germans were found days later by the inhabitants of the village, who, seeing that there was no more fighting, returned to their homes. Believing that the bodies belonged to soldiers fallen in battle, they buried them without knowing that they had actually been victims of a massacre. Only decades later, in 2018, a group of American journalists presented their investigation and the truth came out. Today, the events of Chenogne are remembered as one of the many horrors typical of all wars. We have reached the end of the video. Leave us your answer in the comment box below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.